One of the most shocking events in English history took place on the 30th of January 1649 on Whitehall in London. King Charles I, the Stuart King of England, Scotland and Ireland, who had lost the English Civil War, was taken out of a window in the banqueting house onto a scaffold which had been built for his execution. Many of the most powerful parliamentarians had signed the King's death warrant, and a man who was armed with an axe stood on the scaffold by the low block ready for his victim. He was the executioner. It just took one swing of the axe to take King Charles I's head from his shoulders, and the head of the king was not shown to the crowd. But after the execution of the king, there was a significant issue for Parliament, as they did not know where to bury the king's body, but when the location was settled upon, the king's body was buried very quickly in quiet. But the grave and tomb was disturbed a number of times, and shockingly, King Charles I was buried next to one of the most infamous Tudor kings, Henry VIII. But what happened with the disturbing of his tomb? To support, please make sure to subscribe. The burial of King Charles I was not allowed to take place within the walls of Westminster Abbey, as this was denied by the Commission, so the body was instead taken to Windsor Castle, in secret at night, on the 7th of February 1649. It had been decided to bury the king within St George's Chapel there, and specifically inside of the same burial vault that Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour were buried within. At the time, the large royal vault, which exists today in St George's, did not exist, as this was created in the centuries after. The vault of Henry VIII on the 9th of February 1649 was opened, and the body of King Charles I was placed inside the vault next to Henry VIII's. It was noted that during the preparations for Charles's interment, that the coffin of King Henry VIII was very badly damaged and in a bad way, and the trestle that it rested on was actually broken, as the Tudor king's body was moved for Charles I's body. Jane Seymour's coffin was moved closest to the side of one of the walls, and this was kept in very good condition, and still today, 500 years after her death, it's believed that this coffin is in the best way. Charles's large coffin was lowered in, and was then left in the sealed vault for many years. During the reign of Queen Anne, one of her infant children was buried in the same vault, and they were placed in a small coffin at the feet of Henry and Charles. But the coffin and remains of King Charles I had been buried in such secrecy that his own son, the restored monarch Charles II, could not find his father, and he wanted to exhume him and then bury him in a huge mausoleum inside of Hyde Park. Charles I's body remained within St George's Chapel, under the feet of the Garter Knights for many years. It was in the 1800s that the remains were found finally of the executed king, and Sir Henry Halford had made it his mission to find them. It was known that Charles had been buried somewhere within St George's Chapel, but the specific whereabouts had troubled historians. But in 1813 the vault was accidentally opened during building works, and besides the coffin of Henry VIII, there were two other coffins found. The Prince Regent, the future George IV, ordered that some work would be done to confirm the remains of those inside the vault, and on the 1st of April 1813, the vault was opened in the presence of the Prince Regent and others. Henry Halford had at least discovered the coffin of King Charles I, and he went further, and he opened the coffin of the executed king. This is what he documented following opening the coffin. He wrote, "On removing the pall, a plain leaden coffin with no appearance of ever having been enclosed in wood, and bearing an inscription, King Charles 1648, in large legible characters, on a scroll of lead encircling it, immediately presented itself to view. A square opening was then made in the upper part of the lid, of such dimensions as to admit a clear insight into the contents. These were an internal wooden coffin, very much decayed, and the body carefully wrapped up in cerecloth, into the folds of which quantity of unctuous or greasy matter mixed with resin, as it seemed, had been melted, so as to exclude, as effectually as possible, the external air. The coffin was completely full, and from the tendency of the cerecloth, great difficulty was experienced in detaching it successfully from the parts which it enveloped. Wherever the unctuous matter had insinuated itself, the separation of the cerecloth was easy, and when it came off, a correct impression of the features to which it had been applied was observed in the unctuous substance. At length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval, many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. Henry Howard had opened the coffin of King Charles I, and he had even lifted the head of the king. He then claimed that it was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead, and eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen which touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had remarkably fresh appearances, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. On holding up the head to examine the place of separation from the body, the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surfaces of the divided portions perfectly smooth and even, an appearance which could have been produced only by a heavy blow, inflicted by a very sharp instrument, and which furnished a last proof wanting to identify King Charles I. Following the examination of the king's head, the decision was then made to close the coffin for the final time, and there was no examination below the neck of the king. The vault was then closed, and it's believed that this was the last time that the executed king's vault was opened. But Sir Henry Howard later bragged that he had kept the fourth cervical vertebrae of King Charles I, and he claimed to show this around at dinner parties. Henry Howard's discovery of King Charles I's tomb and remains also showed that the king's head had been sewn back on following his execution, but in the years since the thread had decayed and his head had fallen off his shoulders. The head of the king was in relatively good condition until it was exposed to the air for the first time in over 150 years. It was lifelike, and the king's beard was still on his face, and it was said that he showed great likeness to the portraits of him that had been painted. But this was the last time that the grave and burial vault of Charles I had been opened. But the damage Howard had done exposing the king's remains to the air was irreversible. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.